The November fog that descended upon London in the year 1891 was of that particularly dense and malevolent character which seems to transform the familiar metropolis into something altogether more sinister and mysterious. It crept through the streets like a living thing, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and reducing the cheerful glow of gas lamps to mere amber phantoms in the murky darkness. Yet it was not in the bustling heart of the city that this fog would claim its most dramatic victim, but rather upon the wild expanse of Hampstead Heath, where civilization yields reluctantly to the ancient moorland that has brooded over North London since time immemorial. Sir Reginald Ashworth, the distinguished antiquarian and collector of medieval manuscripts, had always maintained that Ashworth Manor possessed an atmosphere unlike any other residence in England. Built upon the very edge of the heath in the reign of Elizabeth, the house seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, its mullioned windows staring out across the wind-swept grassland like the hollow eyes of some great stone beast. It was here, in his locked and barred study, that Sir Reginald met his end on the night of November 12th, a death so savage and inexplicable that even the most hardened members of Scotland Yard found themselves whispering of supernatural agency. The discovery was made by Higgins, the elderly butler, when Sir Reginald failed to appear for his customary morning breakfast. The study door was locked from within, the key still turned in its mechanism. The windows, fitted with iron bars installed by Sir Reginald's grandfather during the Jacobite troubles, remained securely latched. Yet within this sealed chamber, the master of Ashworth Manor lay dead upon his Persian carpet, his throat torn by what the police surgeon could only describe as wounds consistent with the attack of some large predatory animal. More disturbing still were the other details that emerged in the following hours. Several coarse, dark hairs were found clutched in the victim's fingers, hairs that defied identification as belonging to any known domestic creature. Deep scratches scarred the oak paneling of the study walls, and a peculiar, musky odor permeated the room, described by one constable as the scent of the wild. Most unsettling of all were the reports from the surrounding countryside. 3 separate witnesses claimed to have heard an unearthly howling echoing across the heath during the small hours of the morning, a sound that seemed to blend human anguish with the cry of some primeval beast. The local constabulary, faced with a locked-room mystery that appeared to defy all rational explanation, found themselves grasping at the ancient legends that had haunted Hampstead Heath for generations. Tales of the wandering wolfman, a creature said to roam the moorland during the dark of the moon, suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like grim prophecy. Case introduction. It was against this backdrop of growing panic and supernatural speculation that I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself observing my remarkable friend and colleague, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, on the morning of November 14th. The newspapers had been full of the Ashworth Manor tragedy for 2 days running, each edition more sensational than the last, yet Holmes appeared supremely indifferent to the growing hysteria that gripped London's northern suburbs. He sat in his familiar position by the window of our Baker Street lodgings, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey morning light, his long fingers steepled before his face in an attitude of profound contemplation. The remains of his breakfast lay untouched upon the table, while the morning editions of 3 different newspapers were scattered about his feet, apparently discarded after the briefest perusal. "You have read the accounts of the Ashworth Manor incident, I presume?" I ventured, setting down my coffee cup with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. "I've glanced at them," Holmes replied without moving from his position. "The popular press has, as usual, confused sensation with information. However, there are certain elements of interest buried beneath the melodramatic prose. Indeed, the locked room aspect seems genuinely puzzling, even to my medically trained mind. How does one account for such savage wounds inflicted within a sealed chamber?" Holmes finally turned to regard me, and I was struck by the peculiar intensity of his grey eyes. a look I had come to associate with those moments when his remarkable intellect had begun to engage with a problem of genuine complexity. Consider, Watson, the fundamental assumptions underlying your question. You speak of savage wounds as though their nature were established fact, yet what do we actually know beyond the impressions of a country police surgeon who has likely never encountered anything more exotic than a coaching accident? You mention a sealed chamber, but how thoroughly has the integrity of that seal been examined? Most importantly, you accept the premise that the wounds were inflicted within the room, rather than considering whether the victim might have been attacked elsewhere and subsequently transported to his study. I found myself nodding slowly as Holmes outlined these possibilities, though one aspect of the case continued to trouble me. But surely the reports of this wolf-man creature cannot be entirely dismissed. 3 independent witnesses heard the howling and the local legends. "Ah, Watson," Holmes interrupted, rising from his chair with that sudden animation that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Now you touch upon the most fascinating aspect of this entire affair. Local legends, you say? Precisely how convenient that this ancient folklore should manifest itself at the very moment when Sir Reginald Ashworth meets his mysterious end. One might almost suspect that someone possessed of considerable cunning has deliberately invoked these supernatural associations to obscure a more prosaic, yet infinitely more interesting, motive for murder." Before I could respond to this intriguing observation, our conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stair, accompanied by the lighter tread of what was clearly a visitor in considerable distress. Holmes's eyes brightened with unmistakable anticipation. "Unless I am much mistaken, Watson, we are about to receive a first-hand account of the Hampstead Heath mystery. Pray observe our visitor's demeanor carefully. I suspect we shall find that the true horror of this case lies not in supernatural agency, but in very human deception of the most elaborate and dangerous kind." The door opened to admit a young woman whose pale features and trembling hands spoke eloquently of recent terror, yet whose determined bearing suggested a strength of character that even the most extraordinary circumstances had failed to break entirely. As she stepped into our sitting room, her eyes moving nervously between Holmes and myself, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the threshold of an adventure that would test even my friend's remarkable powers to their utmost limits. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was about to begin in earnest. The young woman who entered our chambers bore herself with the composed dignity of one accustomed to refined society, yet her pallor and the slight tremor in her gloved hands spoke eloquently of recent shock and distress. She was perhaps 25, dressed in a traveling costume of excellent quality, though bearing the unmistakable signs of hasty preparation, and a journey undertaken in considerable agitation. Holmes, who had remained standing since her approach was announced, regarded her with that peculiar intensity of observation that I had witnessed countless times before. His grey eyes swept over her person with the methodical precision of a naturalist examining a rare specimen, missing no detail however minute. "Miss Catherine Ashworth, I presume," said he, before our visitor had uttered a single word. "Niece to the late Sir Reginald, recently arrived from Hampstead by way of the Metropolitan Railway, and possessed of information regarding your uncle's death that has not yet reached the ears of Scotland Yard." The young lady started visibly, her dark eyes widening with a mixture of astonishment and relief. "Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly know? But yes, you are correct in every particular. I'm Catherine Ashworth, and I have indeed come regarding my uncle's terrible death. But how? The explanation is elementary, my dear Miss Ashworth," Holmes replied with that faint smile that invariably accompanied his more impressive deductions. "Your mourning dress, though hastily donned, is of the finest quality and cut in the latest fashion, clearly the garment of a lady of means rather than a dependent. The particular shade of mud upon your boots is distinctive to the clay paths of Hampstead Heath, while the faint metallic dust upon your gloves indicates recent contact with railway fittings. More significantly, I observe a small tear in your sleeve, freshly made and precisely positioned where one might catch it upon a thorny hedge while walking in haste across rough ground. You have been to the scene of the tragedy this very morning, have you not?" "Indeed I have," she replied, sinking gratefully into the chair Holmes indicated. "I could not bear to remain in that dreadful house a moment longer, yet I felt compelled to see for myself the room where poor Uncle Reginald met his end. The police have sealed it, but I managed to glimpse the interior through a gap in the shutters." She shuddered delicately. The sight was most disturbing. "Pray compose yourself, Miss Ashworth," I interjected, offering her a glass of brandy from our sideboard. "You're among friends here, and Mr. Holmes has solved mysteries far more perplexing than this." She accepted the brandy gratefully, though I noticed she barely touched it to her lips. "You must understand, gentlemen, that my uncle was the most rational of men. A scholar of medieval history, a collector of ancient manuscripts, a man who lived by logic and evidence. The notion that he could fall victim to some legendary creature is simply inconceivable." Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "Yet the physical evidence would seem to suggest something quite extraordinary occurred within his study. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, had your uncle seemed troubled in recent days? Had anything occurred to disturb his usual routine?" "That is precisely what makes this affair so bewildering," she replied, her composure wavering slightly. "Uncle Reginald had been in remarkably high spirits recently. 3 weeks ago, he acquired what he described as the crown jewel of his collection, a 13th century illuminated bestiary, one of only 3 known copies in existence. He was absolutely jubilant about it, spending every spare moment studying its contents and preparing a scholarly paper on its significance." "Indeed. And this manuscript? Where is it now?" Miss Ashworth's face grew troubled. "That is another mystery entirely, Mr. Holmes. The manuscript has vanished. Uncle Reginald kept it in a specially constructed case within his study, secured with a unique lock of his own design. When the police searched the room after discovering his body, the case was found empty. There was no sign of the lock being forced. It had been opened with the proper key." Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose which indicated his mind was working at its highest pitch. "Most interesting. Who else knew of this acquisition?" Uncle Reginald was not secretive by nature. He had mentioned it to several colleagues in the antiquarian community, Professor Blackwood from the British Museum, Dr. Marsh, who specializes in medieval texts, and— she hesitated, a faint flush coloring her pale cheeks. "And Mr. Edmund Carstairs, a private collector who had been rather persistent in his attentions to Uncle Reginald's collection." "Ah," Holmes murmured, and I detected a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Mr. Carstairs was a frequent visitor to Ashworth Manor. Indeed, perhaps too frequent for proper decorum. He had been pressing Uncle Reginald to sell him certain items and had become quite insistent. I confess I found his manner somewhat unsettling. There was something predatory about his interest in our family's treasures." Holmes ceased his pacing and fixed our visitor with a penetrating stare. "Miss Ashworth, did you hear the howling that has so captured the imagination of the local population?" She shuddered visibly. "I heard something, Mr. Holmes, a sound unlike anything in my experience. It seemed to come from the very heart of the heath itself, wild and mournful and somehow hungry. But I cannot believe it was anything more than some large dog, perhaps escaped from a traveling menagerie." "Miss Ashworth," Holmes said with quiet intensity, "I fear this case may prove more dangerous than you realize. Watson and I shall accompany you back to Hampstead this very afternoon. Until this mystery is resolved, I strongly advise that you do not venture onto the heath alone, particularly after dark." The young woman's eyes widened in alarm. "You believe I'm in danger?" "I believe," Holmes replied gravely, "that your uncle's death was merely the opening move in a game of considerably greater complexity than anyone yet suspects. The wandering wolf-man may indeed walk the heath, but I suspect we shall find that this particular beast possesses a most human intelligence and decidedly mortal motives. The afternoon journey to Hampstead proved most illuminating, though not entirely in the manner I had anticipated. Holmes had insisted upon taking the Metropolitan Railway rather than a hansom cab, claiming that the elevated perspective would afford him a better view of the Heath's topography. As our carriage rattled northward through the increasingly sparse suburbs, he maintained an intense scrutiny of the landscape, occasionally making cryptic notes in his pocket-book. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said without lifting his gaze from the window, "had your uncle made any enemies in recent years? Academic rivalries can be surprisingly bitter affairs, particularly when valuable manuscripts are involved." Our companion considered this carefully before responding. Uncle Reginald was generally well regarded in scholarly circles, though he could be quite cutting when confronted with inferior scholarship. Dr. Marsh, whom I mentioned earlier, had published a paper last spring that Uncle Reginald criticized rather harshly in the Archaeological Review. They had not spoken since. And this Dr. Marsh, describe him if you would. A thin, nervous man with prematurely grey hair and the most peculiar habit of constantly adjusting his spectacles. He specializes in medieval bestiaries, which made Uncle Reginald's recent acquisition all the more significant to his own research. Holmes finally turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Watson, you will note that we now have two individuals with both motive and opportunity. Mr. Carstairs, the persistent collector, and Dr. Marsh, the rival scholar." Miss Ashworth grew visibly agitated as we approached our destination. "Gentlemen, I must confess something that I have not yet told the police. On the night of Uncle Reginald's death, I was not entirely truthful about my whereabouts." Holmes leaned forward with immediate attention. "Indeed. Pray continue, Miss Ashworth." "I told the constables that I had retired early, but the truth is, I suffered from insomnia and was reading by my window, which faces toward the Heath. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, I observed a figure moving across the moorland, a tall man in a dark coat, walking with evident purpose toward our house. Could you identify this individual?" The fog was too thick for clear identification, but there was something familiar about his bearing. I had the distinct impression that I had seen this person before, though I cannot say with certainty who it might have been. Ashworth Manor itself rose from the edge of the desolate landscape with grim dignity. Time had blackened its stone facades, and ivy clung thickly to the walls. The narrow, diamond-paned windows regarded the Heath with wary suspicion, as though the house itself were conscious of the wildness pressing against its borders. Inspector Lestrade received us in the library with that air of wary tolerance he reserves for Holmes on those occasions when their professional paths intersect. He was standing by the great fireplace, staring thoughtfully at a large oil portrait that dominated the room. A severe-looking gentleman in Elizabethan ruff, whose cold eyes seemed to follow one about the room. "Sir Lionel Ashworth," Miss Catherine supplied softly, "the one who supposedly hunted the great wolf and received its curse." "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade remarked, "I suppose I should have expected to see you here. The case is in all the papers, and you never could resist a locked door." "Nor you an open and shut theory," Holmes returned pleasantly. "I understand you are in pursuit of a particularly energetic wolf." The inspector flushed slightly. "I am in pursuit of facts, Mr. Holmes. Man found dead in a locked room, throat torn out, strange animal hairs at the scene, and half of Hampstead claiming they heard something howl on the Heath. Then I trust you will not object if I examine this animal's handiwork for myself." The study door stood ajar, having been forced open by the police. A faint, cloying odor still lingered, reminiscent of damp earth and something indefinably wild. Holmes immediately began his meticulous examination, moving with quiet intensity, his long figure bending and stooping, his eyes missing nothing. He circled the dark stain on the Persian rug, examined the scattered papers, then moved toward the fireplace where a half-burned log lay in the grate. "The windows, Inspector? You state they were secured from within?" bolted and barred. No ingress there, and the door was locked from the inside, key still in the mechanism. Holmes examined the heavy velvet curtains, ran a gloved finger along their lower edge, then studied the floorboards beneath. He seemed particularly interested in a tiny scuff mark on the desk leg and a faint discoloration on the wallpaper behind a large globe. The key, Inspector. Was it turned fully in the lock? Fully, certainly. Why does that matter? Details, Inspector, are the foundation upon which truth is built. Holmes straightened, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. This room speaks a language of careful construction and deliberate misdirection. As we prepared to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows beside the gate. A tall, thin man whose nervous manner and constantly adjusting spectacles immediately identified him as Dr. Marsh. His presence here, at this particular moment, struck me as remarkably convenient indeed. Dr. Marsh approached us with the hesitant, darting movements of a cornered animal, his pale features bearing the unmistakable signs of sleepless nights and considerable anxiety. Behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes shifted nervously between Holmes and myself, before settling upon Miss Ashworth with an expression that seemed to blend genuine sympathy with something altogether more calculating. "Miss Ashworth?" he began, his voice carrying the precise diction of academic circles, though I detected an underlying tremor of agitation. "Please accept my deepest condolences. Your uncle was a scholar of extraordinary distinction, and his loss is felt keenly throughout our community." "Dr. Marsh," she replied with cool politeness that barely concealed her distaste. "I had not expected to encounter you here." The thin scholar adjusted his spectacles with that characteristic gesture she had described, his fingers betraying a slight tremor. I confess I felt compelled to pay my respects, despite the unfortunate circumstances of our recent professional disagreement. Sir Reginald and I may have differed on matters of interpretation, but I held his scholarship in the highest regard. Holmes stepped forward with that deceptively casual manner which invariably preceded his most penetrating inquiries. "Dr. Ambrose Marsh, I presume, specialist in medieval zoological texts and frequent contributor to scholarly journals. I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson." "The consulting detective," Marsh replied, adjusting his spectacles once more. "Your reputation precedes you, though I confess myself puzzled as to why Scotland Yard would require assistance in what appears to be a most supernatural occurrence. Indeed, you subscribe to the theory of lupine intervention." Holmes's grey eyes fixed upon the scholar with that peculiar intensity I had witnessed countless times before. Marsh laughed nervously, though the sound held little genuine mirth. "Hardly, Mr. Holmes. My academic training demands rational explanations for all phenomena. Yet the evidence in this case seems to defy conventional analysis." "On the contrary, Dr. Marsh, I find the evidence most illuminating when properly examined." Holmes' voice carried that note of quiet satisfaction that indicated his remarkable mind had already begun to penetrate the mystery's outer defenses. "Consider, for instance, the nature of the wounds described in the police surgeon's report. We are told of tears consistent with animal attack, yet I observed no corresponding damage to Sir Reginald's clothing. A creature capable of inflicting such savage injuries would surely have shredded his garments as well." Dr. Marsh had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, and I noticed his hands trembling as he reached once again for his spectacles. "Most observant, Mr. Holmes, though surely such details could be explained by the victim's movements during the attack?" "Possibly, though I find it curious that you should be so well informed regarding the specifics of the crime scene. The police have been notably reticent about releasing such details to the press." Before Marsh could formulate a response to this pointed observation, the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel announced the arrival of another visitor. A sleek, dark brougham drew up before the manor's entrance, and from it emerged a man whose very presence seemed to command attention. He was perhaps in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in the finest London tailoring, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing dark eyes that swept over our assembled company with an almost proprietary assessment. "Mr. Edmund Carstairs," Miss Ashworth murmured, and I detected a note of distinct unease in her voice. Carstairs advanced with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his desires accommodated, offering a solicitous bow to Miss Ashworth while his calculating gaze took in every detail of the scene before him. "Inspector Lestrade, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of wealth and education. "I trust you are making progress in resolving this dreadful affair. Sir Reginald was a dear friend, and his loss is keenly felt by all who appreciated his exquisite taste in antiquities." "We are making progress, Mr. Carstairs," Lestrade replied, though his tone had grown noticeably cooler. "And I believe Mr. Holmes here has questions for you as well." Carstairs turned to Holmes with evident interest, producing a silver cigarette case with practiced elegance. "The famous consulting detective. I have followed your cases with considerable fascination. What can I tell you about poor Reginald's unfortunate end? Perhaps you might enlighten us regarding your interest in Sir Reginald's recently acquired bestiary." Holmes replied with deceptive mildness. "Miss Ashworth informs me you are rather persistent in your desire to acquire it." Carstairs' smile remained fixed, though I observed his eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "A magnificent piece, truly. Any serious collector would have coveted it, but Sir Reginald was not easily persuaded to part with his treasures." He exhaled a plume of fragrant smoke, his gaze drifting toward the manor with what struck me as an appraising calculation. The police seemed convinced that some wild animal was responsible. Rather far-fetched, I should think. More likely a common burglar. These old houses are rarely as secure as their owners imagine. Holmes observed both men with that detached intensity that indicated his mind was rapidly cataloguing every detail of their behavior and statements. As the shadows lengthened across the heath and the first tendrils of evening mist began to rise from the ancient moorland, I could not shake the feeling that we stood in the presence of at least one individual whose interest in Sir Reginald's death extended far beyond mere scholarly concern or social sympathy. The game was indeed growing more complex with each passing hour. As the November twilight settled over Hampstead Heath with its characteristic blend of melancholy and foreboding, Holmes made an unexpected proposal that would prove to alter the entire course of our investigation. Rather than returning immediately to Baker Street, he suggested that we accept Miss Ashworth's hospitality for the evening, a decision that brought together all the principal figures in our mysterious drama under one ancient and troubled roof, the evening assembly. The dining hall of Ashworth Manor presented a scene of Gothic grandeur that evening, its oak-panelled walls adorned with centuries of family portraits whose stern gazes seemed to follow our every movement. The long table, polished by generations of use, accommodated our peculiar assembly. Miss Catherine Ashworth presiding with nervous dignity, Holmes and myself positioned to observe the interplay of our companions, Inspector Lestrade maintaining his official bearing despite the unconventional circumstances, and, by Miss Ashworth's reluctant invitation, both Dr. Marsh and Mr. Carstairs, who had lingered despite the gathering darkness. The conversation over dinner proved most illuminating, though perhaps not in the manner our hostess had intended. Carstairs, ever the polished gentleman, dominated much of the discourse with tales of his various acquisitions and scholarly pursuits. Yet I detected, beneath his cultured manner, that same predatory gleam Holmes had noted earlier. "Your uncle and I enjoyed a most mutually beneficial relationship," Carstairs was explaining to Miss Ashworth, his dark eyes never quite meeting hers directly. "I assisted him in acquiring several valuable manuscripts, and occasionally he would consider my offers when financial circumstances required certain adjustments to his collection." Miss Ashworth's response carried a distinct chill. "My uncle was not in financial distress, Mr. Carstairs. His affairs were, to my knowledge, in excellent order." Holmes, who had been pushing his food about his plate with that absent-minded air he adopts when his intellect is engaged elsewhere, looked up with sudden interest. Sir Reginald maintained comprehensive insurance on his collection, did he not? A prudent precaution for any serious antiquarian. Indeed he did, Miss Ashworth confirmed, looking somewhat surprised by the question. The policy with Hargreaves and Sons was renewed only last month, following the acquisition of the bestiary. The coverage was quite substantial. I observed Carstairs' fork pause for the briefest instant before he resumed eating, while Dr. Marsh seemed to grow even paler, his nervous fingers perpetually adjusting his spectacles or fidgeting with his wine-glass. The systematic investigation. Following dinner, as our various companions dispersed to their respective pursuits, Holmes drew me aside for a more thorough examination of the crime scene. The study, with its lingering atmosphere of violence and mystery, seemed to whisper secrets to those possessed of sufficient skill to interpret its silent testimony. "Watson," Holmes began, producing his magnifying glass and moving with characteristic precision toward the door, "observe this lock mechanism with particular care." Inspector Lestrade noted that the key was found turned fully in its mechanism, suggesting the room was sealed from within. Yet examine these minute scratches upon the inner plate of the keyhole, barely visible to the naked eye, but unmistakably present. I bent to study the area he indicated, noting the faint but distinct marks he had discovered. What do they suggest? They suggest that this key was not merely turned by someone familiar with its workings, but rather manipulated with some force, jiggled, if you will, as though by someone attempting to simulate a genuine locking from within while actually working from the exterior of the door. Holmes then directed my attention to the window frames where his keen eyes had detected a series of minute scratches upon the interior surface. Note these marks, Watson. Fresh scratches, made recently, yet positioned in such a manner as to suggest an attempt to create the impression of claws scraping against the glass from within. Moving to the fireplace, he indicated the half-burned log and the faint traces of soot upon the mantelpiece. A man in the throes of a bestial attack does not pause to rest his bloodied hands upon the mantel. These marks were placed deliberately as part of an elaborate staging designed to support our supernatural narrative. The legend and its manipulation. As we continued our investigation, Miss Ashworth provided us with the detailed history of the family curse that had so conveniently manifested itself. The legend of Sir Lionel Ashworth and the Great Wolf, dating to the 16th century, spoke of a dying creature's curse that the Ashworth line would never know peace until the debt was paid in kind. According to tradition, this curse would manifest during the dark of the moon, when the boundary between natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. Most convenient timing, Holmes observed with that dry irony that invariably accompanied his most significant insights. The night of Sir Reginald's death was indeed moonless, and our mysterious wolfman has chosen to honor this ancient schedule with remarkable precision. Dr. Marsh, who had grown increasingly agitated throughout the evening, seemed particularly affected by any mention of the supernatural elements. His scholarly demeanor cracked visibly when the distant howling began to echo across the heath, that same mournful sound that had terrified the local population. "Dear God," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for his spectacles. "It is the same sound reported on the night of Sir Reginald's death." Carstairs, by contrast, maintained an almost theatrical composure, dismissing the howling as mere atmospheric conditions and acoustic effects for which the heath was notorious. Yet his very insistence upon rational explanations struck me as somewhat excessive, as though he were attempting to convince himself as much as his audience. The deductive synthesis. Holmes gathered all these elements together with that remarkable facility for synthesis that distinguished his method from mere observation. "Gentlemen," he announced as the howling rose again from the darkened moorland, "we are witnessing not the manifestation of ancient curses, but rather the final act of a most carefully orchestrated deception. Our wolfman is no creature of legend, but a human predator whose appetite extends far beyond mere manuscripts. The physical evidence, he explained, pointed unmistakably toward deliberate staging. The lock manipulation, the window scratches, the fireplace marks, the convenient timing with lunar cycles, all suggested someone intimately familiar with both the family legends and the practical requirements of creating a convincing supernatural narrative. The missing bestiary represents merely the visible motive, Holmes continued, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight with an almost predatory intensity of their own. The true prize may well be the insurance settlement that would follow such a spectacular and inexplicable loss. A collection destroyed by supernatural agency would present fewer questions than one simply stolen by conventional means. As if summoned by his words, the howling rose once more from the heath, closer now and possessed of an urgency that seemed to herald the approaching climax of our mysterious affair. Through the study window, a tall, shadowy figure could be glimpsed moving with unnatural speed along the boundary where civilization yielded to the ancient wildness of the moorland. Holmes moved to the window, his expression grave with the weight of approaching revelation. "The game, Watson, has entered its most dangerous phase. Our adversary grows bold, perhaps desperate. Before this night is through, I believe we shall witness the final transformation of legend into reality, though not, perhaps, in the manner our wolf-man intends." The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only our courage but our understanding of the thin line between human cunning and the primal forces that lurk just beyond the comfortable boundaries of gaslight and civilization. The second howl that pierced the November darkness carried with it a quality of menace that seemed to penetrate the very stones of Ashworth Manor. Unlike the distant cries we had heard previously, this sound emanated from somewhere perilously close to the house itself, so close indeed that the ancient window panes rattled faintly in their leaded frames. The cry began as a low, guttural growl before rising to a prolonged wail that seemed to blend the anguish of a wounded beast with something disturbingly human in its modulation. Miss Ashworth gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white against the dark wood, while Inspector Lestrade instinctively reached for the revolver he carried. Dr. Marsh had grown even paler, if such a thing were possible, his nervous fingers working constantly at his spectacles as though the familiar gesture might somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. Holmes alone remained perfectly composed, though I detected in his sharp profile that peculiar alertness which invariably accompanied the most critical moments of our investigations. He moved to the window and drew back the heavy curtain just enough to peer into the mist-shrouded darkness beyond. "Watson," he said quietly, "your medical training has given you keen powers of observation. What do you make of yonder figure?" I joined him at the window, straining my eyes against the swirling fog that had now enveloped the heath completely. At first I could discern nothing beyond the familiar outlines of gorse and the pale gleam of the path leading toward the deeper moorland. Then, at the very edge of visibility, I detected movement, a tall, unnaturally distorted figure that seemed to glide rather than walk along the boundary where the manor grounds yielded to the wild expanse of the heath. The creature moved with a peculiar, loping gait, its upper body hunched forward in a manner that suggested both predatory intent and something fundamentally wrong with its anatomy. Long arms swung with each stride, and occasionally a low rumbling sound drifted toward us on the damp night air. "There," Miss Ashworth whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Do you see it? The wolf-man walks tonight." Holmes's hand shot out to restrain Lestrade, who had instinctively moved toward the door. "No, Inspector. A headlong pursuit across the heath in this fog would serve our adversary's purposes far better than our own. We must think rather than react." "You'd have us cower indoors while that thing prowls about?" Lestrade demanded, his professional pride clearly stung. "I would have us observe and deduce, Inspector," Holmes replied with that edge of authority that brooked no argument. "For the first time, our quarry has revealed himself in a form of his own choosing. That revelation is worth more than any number of blind pursuits through treacherous terrain." As if summoned by his words, the howling rose again, but this time Holmes tilted his head with the concentrated attention of a musician detecting a false note in an otherwise perfect performance. "Watson, do you hear that faint mechanical undertone?" The cry possesses a certain artificial resonance that suggests amplification through some form of device. Before I could respond, Holmes had moved away from the window and was conducting a meticulous examination of the study's interior. His keen eyes swept over every surface, missing no detail however minute. Near the fireplace, he suddenly stopped and bent low, his magnifying glass catching the lamplight as he studied something on the floor. "Ah," he murmured, straightening with a small object held delicately between his thumb and forefinger. "Our theatrical friend grows careless in his boldness." "What have you found?" I asked, moving closer to examine his discovery. "A button," Holmes replied, holding it up to the light. "Black horn of superior quality, with a fragment of coarse dark thread still clinging to the shank. Note also this faint smear, grease paint, unless I am much mistaken, of the type employed in theatrical productions." Carstairs, who had been maintaining his characteristic composure throughout these alarming events, laughed softly. "Surely you do not suggest that our legendary beast is merely some poor actor in borrowed costume?" "I suggest, Mr. Carstairs, that we are witnessing a performance of considerable sophistication," Holmes replied, his grey eyes fixing upon our visitor with that penetrating intensity I had witnessed countless times before. "One that requires not only costume and makeup, but careful timing, mechanical assistance, and an intimate knowledge of local folklore." Dr. Marsh had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange, his hands trembling as he repeatedly adjusted his spectacles. "But the wounds, Mr. Holmes, the savage nature of Sir Reginald's injuries, surely no human agency could account for such brutality." "On the contrary, Dr. Marsh, I find that human malice often exceeds in cruelty anything found in the natural world." Holmes moved to examine the window frame more closely, running his gloved fingers along the interior surface. "Consider these minute scratches, Watson. Fresh marks made recently, yet positioned to suggest claws scraping against the glass from within the room." The implications of this observation sent a chill through our assembled company. If Holmes was correct, then someone had deliberately staged these supernatural elements to conceal a very human crime. "Gentlemen," Holmes announced, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction that indicated his remarkable intellect had begun to penetrate the mystery's defenses, "I propose that we venture onto the heath ourselves. Our wolfman has been most obliging in providing us with a performance. It is time we examined his stage more closely." Despite Miss Ashworth's protests and Lestrade's evident reluctance, Holmes led us out into the swirling mist. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, while the gas lamps along the drive cast only feeble halos of light into the impenetrable gloom. Holmes moved with surprising confidence across the treacherous terrain, as though he possessed some innate sense of direction that rendered the fog irrelevant. We had not proceeded far when Holmes suddenly halted, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth near a cluster of ancient oaks. "Observe, Watson, the impression of a boot made within the last day. And note this peculiar scuff mark, as though someone had dragged a heavy object across the ground." As he bent to examine the evidence more closely, a sudden crash echoed from a nearby thicket, followed by a series of frantic snarls and the sound of splintering wood. We pressed forward through the dense undergrowth to discover a small groundskeeper's shed, its door hanging askew on broken hinges. Within, a large mastiff, gaunt from deliberate starvation, was tearing frantically at a sack of raw meat, its eyes wild with hunger and desperation. "A cruel distraction," Holmes observed, his voice tight with disgust. "This poor beast has been deliberately starved and positioned here to provide our wolfman with a convenient source of authentic animal sounds." But his attention had already moved beyond the suffering animal to something half buried in the disturbed earth beneath the collapsed shed. With careful precision, he extracted a small, intricately carved wooden whistle fashioned to resemble a wolf's head. Its dark surface bore traces of the same metallic powder we had observed earlier. "Our howling ghost's secret voice," Holmes murmured, holding the device up to catch the faint moonlight. "Ingeniously designed to amplify and project sound, creating the illusion that the cries originate from various points across the heath." As we examined this crucial evidence, a rustling in the deeper shadows beyond the shed drew our attention. A tall figure moved swiftly away through the mist, disappearing into the dense foliage before any of us could react. Holmes made no move to pursue, instead allowing his gaze to linger thoughtfully on the spot where the figure had vanished. "Our wolf grows bold, Watson," he said quietly, pocketing the whistle with careful precision. "But even the most cunning predator eventually overreaches himself. The game has entered a new phase, one that will require all our skill to navigate safely." As we made our way back toward the manor, the pieces of Holmes' investigation began to form a clearer picture. The Wolfman was indeed human, employing sophisticated theatrical techniques to maintain his supernatural disguise. But the true motive behind this elaborate deception remained tantalizingly out of reach, hidden somewhere in the complex web of relationships surrounding Sir Reginald's death and the mysterious disappearance of his precious bestiary. The night was far from over, and I could not shake the feeling that our adversary's most dangerous moves lay yet ahead. Our return to Ashworth Manor through the thickening fog proved more eventful than our outward journey, for Holmes had barely crossed the threshold when his keen senses detected something amiss within the ancient walls. The very air seemed charged with recent disturbance, and a faint but unmistakable odor, that same musky scent we had encountered in Sir Reginald's study, lingered in the entrance hall like an unwelcome visitor's calling card. "The evidence speaks. Watson," Holmes murmured, his sharp eyes scanning the marble floor of the hallway. "Observe these minute traces of mud, fresh deposits made within the last hour. Note also the pattern of their distribution, suggesting someone has moved through this house with considerable urgency." Miss Ashworth, who had been maintaining admirable composure throughout our nocturnal expedition, grew visibly pale at this observation. "You mean to say the creature has been inside the manor?" "I mean to say that someone has been inside the manor," Holmes corrected with that precision of language which invariably accompanied his most significant deductions. "Someone who wished to give the impression of bestial intrusion while conducting a very human search." Holmes produced the wolf-head whistle from his pocket, holding it up to catch the lamplight. The carved surface gleamed with that peculiar metallic powder we had observed throughout our investigation, and I could see now that the device was far more sophisticated than it had first appeared. This whistle, combined with the starved mastiff we discovered, represents only the auditory component of our theatrical performance, Holmes explained, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction that indicated his remarkable mind had begun to perceive the full scope of the deception. "The visual elements, the costume, the makeup, the carefully choreographed appearances require both considerable resources and intimate knowledge of the local terrain." Dr. Marsh, who had grown increasingly agitated throughout this exposition, suddenly stepped forward with trembling hands. "Mr. Holmes, there is something I must confess, something that may cast this entire affair in a different light." Holmes turned to regard the nervous scholar with that penetrating intensity I'd witnessed so many times before. "Indeed, Dr. Marsh, I confess myself most eager to hear what additional illumination you might provide." "Sir Reginald's bestiary," Marsh began, his voice barely above a whisper, "was not merely valuable as a medieval manuscript. In his final letter to me, a letter I received only yesterday, he revealed that he had discovered something extraordinary within its illuminated pages. The hidden treasure. The scholar's revelation transformed our understanding of the case entirely. According to his account, Sir Reginald had detected a subtle cipher woven into the decorative elements of the bestiary's illuminated borders, a code that revealed the location of a cache of Byzantine gold coins hidden by medieval monks during the turbulent years of the Crusades. The manuscript was essentially a treasure map, Marsh explained, his academic excitement momentarily overcoming his obvious terror. Sir Reginald believed the coins were concealed somewhere within the foundations of this very manor, placed there by the original builder who had acquired the bestiary from a dissolved monastery. Holmes absorbed this information with that remarkable facility for synthesis that distinguished his method from mere observation. Most illuminating, Dr. Marsh. This revelation explains several puzzling aspects of our case: the methodical nature of the study's ransacking, the particular care taken to remove the bestiary while leaving other valuable items untouched, and most significantly, the elaborate theatrical deception designed to obscure the true motive for murder. Carstairs, who had maintained his characteristic composure throughout these revelations, finally spoke with a note of barely controlled tension in his cultured voice. Surely you do not suggest that someone would commit murder for what amounts to medieval folklore. These tales of hidden treasure are common enough among old families. On the contrary, Mr. Carstairs, Holmes replied, his grey eyes fixing upon our visitor with that peculiar intensity that invariably preceded his most devastating observations. I suggest that someone has committed murder for a treasure that is very real indeed. The question that remains is whether that someone acted alone or whether he possessed an accomplice, intimately familiar with both the family legends and the practical requirements of creating a convincing supernatural narrative. The net tightens. Holmes moved to examine the entrance hall more closely, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped ordinary observation. Near the base of the grand staircase, he discovered several more of those coarse, dark threads we had been finding throughout our investigation, along with traces of the same metallic powder that clung to the wolf-head whistle. Our wolfman has grown careless in his desperation, Holmes observed, carefully preserving the evidence in his pocketbook. The discovery of his acoustic device has forced him to accelerate his timeline, leading to mistakes that will ultimately prove his undoing. As if summoned by his words, a distant sound echoed from the upper reaches of the house. Not the supernatural howling we had grown accustomed to, but the unmistakable creak of floorboards under stealthy footsteps. Holmes raised his hand for silence, his head tilted in that attitude of concentrated listening that indicated his remarkable faculties were focused entirely upon the sounds from above. "He is still here," Holmes whispered, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "Our theatrical friend has not yet completed his performance. The final act, I believe, is about to begin." The ancient manor seemed to hold its breath around us as we stood in the entrance hall, acutely aware that somewhere in the darkness above, a desperate and dangerous adversary was preparing to make his ultimate move. The comfortable certainties of gaslight and civilization felt suddenly fragile against the weight of centuries-old stone, and the knowledge that a human predator stalked the corridors where generations of Ashworths had lived and died. Holmes drew his service revolver with quiet efficiency, checking its mechanism with the practiced movements of a man who had faced danger in many forms. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "the game has entered its most perilous phase. Our wolfman knows that discovery is imminent, and desperate men are capable of extraordinary violence. I suggest we proceed with the utmost caution." As we prepared to ascend the darkened staircase toward whatever confrontation awaited us in the shadows above, I could not help but reflect that the ancient curse of the Ashworth family was about to claim another victim, though perhaps not in the manner the legends had foretold. The ascent of that ancient staircase remains etched in my memory with peculiar vividness, each step carrying us deeper into the psychological labyrinth our adversary had so carefully constructed. The gas sconces along the upper landing had been extinguished, leaving us to navigate by the uncertain glow of Inspector Lestrade's bullseye lantern, whose narrow beam seemed to intensify rather than dispel the oppressive darkness that shrouded the manor's upper reaches. Holmes moved with that feline grace he displayed in moments of extreme peril. His revolver held ready while his keen senses remained alert to every subtle indication of our quarry's presence. The ancient floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet, despite our efforts at stealth, and I could not shake the feeling that we were being observed by the stern-faced portraits that lined the corridor walls. Generations of Ashworths whose cold eyes seemed to reflect an almost prophetic awareness of the violence that had already stained their ancestral home. The wolf's lair, discovered. From somewhere ahead came the unmistakable sounds of frantic activity, not the supernatural prowling of legend, but the desperate movements of someone engaged in methodical search. Holmes paused at the entrance to the east tower, his sharp features etched in chiaroscuro by the lantern light as he examined the heavy oak door with his magnifying glass. "Recently forced," he murmured, indicating minute scratches around the ancient lock mechanism. "Our theatrical friend has been busy indeed." The door swung inward at his touch, revealing a chamber that served as the wolfman's private laboratory of deception. The circular room was dominated by a crude wooden table laden with the apparatus of elaborate disguise. Pots of dark grease paint, sticks of theatrical makeup, coarse animal hair brushes, stiff with dried pigment, and several false beards of varying textures. Most striking was the costume itself, a full-body garment of stitched pelts hanging from a wooden frame, complete with articulated gloves tipped with wickedly sharp metal claws. Holmes moved immediately to examine a peculiar mechanical device in the corner, an ingenious arrangement of bellows connected by rubber tubes to various points in the costume. "Observe, Watson, when operated, this apparatus would amplify the wearer's breathing, creating that distinctive resonant growling we heard across the heath. Most sophisticated indeed." The confrontation. A sudden crash from behind a tapestry-covered alcove announced our quarry's presence. Before any of us could react, the hanging was thrust aside and Dr. Ambrose Marsh burst forth, no longer the nervous academic we had known, but a figure transformed by desperation and fury. His face bore smears of dark pigment. His clothing was disheveled from frantic searching, and in his trembling hands he clutched a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of metal coins. "Stand back!" he cried, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You understand nothing of what Ashworth stole from me, what he cost me." Lestrade moved to intercept him, but Marsh proved surprisingly agile, dodging past us toward the narrow tower window. Holmes, however, had anticipated this maneuver, positioning himself to block the scholar's escape with a well-timed intervention that sent both men tumbling to the stone floor in a tangle of limbs. The method revealed. As Lestrade secured the struggling Marsh with handcuffs, Holmes examined the contents of the leather pouch, revealing a collection of Byzantine gold coins whose distinctive markings confirmed our suspicions about the hidden treasure. But it was Holmes's explanation of the murder method that truly demonstrated the elaborate nature of the deception. "Dr. Marsh knew of Sir Reginald's weak heart," Holmes began, his grey eyes fixed upon our captive with that penetrating intensity I had witnessed so many times before. Rather than risk direct confrontation, he chose a more subtle approach. The howling from the heath, amplified by his mechanical devices, was designed to induce fatal cardiac distress. Sir Reginald died of fright, Watson, a heart attack brought on by the apparent manifestation of his family's ancient curse. "But the wounds," I interjected, still puzzled by the savage nature of the injuries described in the police reports. "Inflicted post-mortem," Holmes replied grimly, "using those metal claws to simulate animal attack and deflect suspicion onto supernatural agency. The locked room was achieved by manipulating the key from outside using a thin wire. Those scratches I noted on the lock mechanism were the evidence of this deception." Marsh's composure finally shattered completely under the weight of exposure. "He mocked my work," he shrieked, struggling against his bonds. 20 years of research, dismissed with a laugh. The bestiary was mine by right. I deciphered the cipher. I located the treasure. Ashworth was nothing but a wealthy dilettante who stole credit for discoveries he could never have made. The deeper game. As we prepared to escort our prisoner from his elaborate lair, Holmes paused to examine several papers scattered across the work table, detailed architectural drawings of the manor's foundations, annotated with exploratory marks and calculations. His expression grew thoughtful as he studied these documents, and I detected that peculiar gleam in his eyes that indicated his remarkable mind had perceived complexities beyond the obvious solution. "Most illuminating," he murmured, folding the papers with careful precision. "Yet I fear, Watson, that Dr. Marsh's theatrical performance may have served purposes beyond his own desperate ambitions. The game, I suspect, has not yet reached its final move." The Wolfman of Hampstead Heath had been unmasked, his elaborate deception laid bare before the cold light of reason. Yet as we descended the ancient staircase with our captive, I could not shake Holmes's suggestion that deeper currents still flowed beneath the surface of this mystery, currents that would require all his remarkable powers to navigate safely. The morning light that filtered through the ancient windows of Ashworth Manor revealed a scene that should have brought satisfaction to any detective, yet Holmes remained curiously restless as Inspector Lestrade completed the arrangements for Dr. Marsh's transport to London. The captured scholar sat hunched in his bonds, muttering incoherently about stolen credit and righteous vengeance, while the physical evidence of his elaborate deception lay scattered about the tower room like the props of some macabre theatrical production. The persistent doubt. "You appear troubled, Holmes," I observed, noting his failure to display that quiet satisfaction which typically accompanied the resolution of a complex case. "Surely Dr. Marsh's confession settles the matter conclusively." Holmes moved to examine once more the sophisticated mechanical apparatus we had discovered, his long fingers tracing the intricate network of tubes and bellows with obvious perplexity. "On the contrary, Watson, I find myself increasingly convinced that we have witnessed not the conclusion of this affair, but merely the exposure of its most visible component." He lifted one of the articulated glove assemblies, studying the wickedly sharp metal claws with his magnifying glass. "Consider the craftsmanship evident in these devices. The precision of the metalwork, the sophisticated understanding of acoustics required for the breathing apparatus, the professional quality of the theatrical makeup, all suggest someone with extensive experience in stagecraft and mechanical engineering. Yet Dr. Marsh," I interjected, beginning to perceive his reasoning, "is a nervous academic whose hands trembled at the mere mention of supernatural phenomena." "Precisely. A man who adjusts his spectacles compulsively and starts at shadows could hardly have constructed such elaborate mechanisms, much less employed them with the theatrical precision we witnessed across the heath." The insurance revelation. Holmes produced from his waistcoat a small fragment of paper, partially trampled into the gravel of the manor's drive. Smoothing it carefully, he revealed a portion of official letterhead bearing the familiar insignia of Hargreaves and Sons, the insurance firm Miss Ashworth had mentioned. "This fragment, Watson, refers to a comprehensive adjustment of coverage, including structural assets and movable antiquities. The revised policy was issued a mere 2 days prior to Sir Reginald's death, at the explicit request of one Edmund Carstairs. The implications struck me immediately. You suspect Carstairs of orchestrating this entire affair. I suspect, my dear fellow, that Mr. Carstairs has been playing a far more sophisticated game than any of us initially perceived. Dr. Marsh, with his known animosity towards Sir Reginald and his obvious instability, provided the perfect scapegoat for a crime of considerably greater complexity. The architectural evidence." Holmes spread the detailed architectural drawings across the breakfast table, his keen eyes studying the precise measurements and professional annotations. These plans, Watson, represent months of careful preparation and considerable expense. Note the intimate knowledge of medieval construction techniques, the accurate mapping of hidden passages that predate even the Elizabethan structure. Miss Ashworth, who had been listening with growing alarm, leaned forward to examine the documents. I had no knowledge that such passages existed within our home. How could Dr. Marsh have acquired such detailed information? He could not, Holmes replied with quiet certainty. These drawings represent the work of someone with both substantial resources and extensive experience in architectural research. Someone who has made a career of studying the vulnerabilities of ancient estates. The trap springs. As if summoned by our discussion, the familiar sound of carriage wheels announced the arrival of Mr. Edmund Carstairs. He entered the breakfast room with his characteristic polish, offering sympathetic condolences while his calculating gaze swept inevitably toward the architectural drawings spread upon the table. Holmes observed this reaction with the focused intensity of a naturalist studying a particularly interesting specimen. Mr. Carstairs, perhaps your expertise as a collector might illuminate the significance of these documents. Dr. Marsh was studying them with considerable interest. Carstairs moved to examine the plans with apparent casualness, yet I detected the subtle changes Holmes had trained me to observe. The slight acceleration of breathing, the unconscious tightening of facial muscles, the way his gloved fingers traced certain passages marked in red ink with unmistakable familiarity. "Fascinating medieval construction," Carstairs murmured, though his voice carried an almost imperceptible tremor. These tunnel systems were probably defensive measures during the Norman period. Or, Holmes interjected with deceptive mildness, convenient means of access for someone intimately familiar with the manor's hidden vulnerabilities. Someone who could move through these passages undetected, stage supernatural manifestations with professional precision, and manipulate an unstable academic into serving as the perfect scapegoat. The physical evidence. Holmes produced the black horn button we had discovered in Sir Reginald's study, holding it up to catch the morning light. "This button, Mr. Carstairs, came from your coat. The thread matches perfectly, and the grease paint residue confirms its connection to our theatrical wolfman." Carstairs' carefully maintained composure began to crack like ice under spring sun. "You have no proof of any conspiracy," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his tone carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction reserved for his most complete deductions. "I have proof of premeditation, opportunity, and motive. The insurance adjustment, the architectural research, the sophisticated equipment, all point to a conspiracy of considerable scope and ambition. The true motive revealed. Your plan was elegant in its simplicity, Mr. Carstairs," Holmes continued, beginning that methodical exposition which invariably preceded his most devastating revelations. Dr. Marsh's known animosity provided the perfect cover for murder, while the Wolfman legend offered a supernatural explanation that would satisfy the public imagination. But the Byzantine treasure was merely a convenient bonus. Your true objective was Sir Reginald's entire collection, which would pass to Miss Ashworth as his sole heir. A young woman, alone and terrified by supernatural manifestations, might well have been persuaded to sell her inheritance at a fraction of its value, particularly to a sympathetic collector who had shown such kindness during her time of distress. The color drained from Carstairs' face as the full scope of his exposure became apparent. His hands, I noticed, had begun to tremble with the same nervous energy we had observed in Dr. Marsh. The confrontation and resolution. "You provided Marsh with everything necessary for his performance," Holmes pressed relentlessly. "The costume, the mechanical devices, the detailed knowledge of family legends. Your experience in theatrical antiquities gave you the expertise to create a convincing supernatural narrative, while the hidden passages allowed you to orchestrate the Wolfman's appearances with professional precision. Meanwhile, Dr. Marsh's unstable temperament ensured he would eventually crack under pressure and confess to crimes he believed he had committed, never realizing he was merely the visible instrument of a far more calculating intelligence. Inspector Lestrade moved forward to place Carstairs under arrest, but Holmes raised a restraining hand. "I fear, Inspector, that legal proof and logical certainty do not always coincide. Mr. Carstairs has been most careful to insulate himself from direct culpability." Holmes fixed our quarry with that penetrating stare I had witnessed countless times before. "However, the scholarly community values reputation above all else, Mr. Carstairs. Should word spread regarding your methodology in acquiring collections, I suspect your associates might view future dealings with considerable skepticism." The threat hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Carstairs straightened, his mask of cultured refinement slipping to reveal something cold and predatory beneath. "You are a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "Very well. I shall withdraw any interest in the Ashworth collection, but I will not confess to crimes I did not technically commit." "Nor do I require you to," Holmes replied with quiet satisfaction. "Prevention, Mr. Carstairs, often serves justice better than prosecution. The law demands confession or proof. I am content with the certainty that this particular wolf will hunt no more." The final resolution. As Carstairs departed with his dignity intact, but his schemes in ruins, Miss Ashworth turned to Holmes with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "I understand perhaps half of what transpired here, Mr. Holmes, but I recognize that without your intervention, I should have lost not only my uncle, but his legacy as well." Holmes waved away her thanks with characteristic impatience. "You possess both courage and intelligence, Miss Ashworth. Employ them wisely in selecting more reputable advisers for the future." The morning sun had fully dispelled the fog that had shrouded Hampstead Heath, revealing the ancient moorland in its true, unenchanted form. As we prepared to depart, the wind carried only the natural sounds of the countryside. No artificial howling, no supernatural menace, merely the eternal dialogue between civilization and the wild spaces that border our ordered world. "The curse is broken," Miss Ashworth murmured, almost to herself. "The deception has been corrected," Holmes amended with characteristic precision. "Curses, Miss Ashworth, are merely stories granted too much authority. Facts are the only ghosts that require proper laying to rest." Thus concluded the case of the wandering wolfman, where ancient legends served as masks for modern avarice, and the greatest monster proved to be not some supernatural beast, but the calculating cruelty of human ambition unchecked by conscience or law.